18. Rodin had never been in the sea, but he'd been close to it at least. He'd stood on the edge of the muddy flats that spread out apparently to the water. And he'd only gone there because it was an easy place to dump bodies, letting them sink into the ooze. The sea itself was a bleak, cold deathtrap, an environment Rodin had no wish to enter. But for the sake of Terrell's character, he had to put his dislike of water to one side. He had to play his part as best he could. And so the next day Rodin researched. After cleaning the rooms and serving Sergio a late breakfast, the man was feeling weary after the party. He ensconced himself in his day room and fed his mind through his screen. There was a lot to take in, but by the time he began preparations for the main meal of the day, Rodin knew his port from his starboard and his tack from his jibe, could describe a dagger board and had learnt the basic mechanics of sheets and sails. And more importantly, he learnt about the dangers of sailing. As Leopold had said, many people used automated systems that enabled them to control the vessel from a screen. But the counselor's preferred hands-on approach involved many acts such as manipulating the tiller, pulling on sheets, and Rodin constantly shook his head at such a stupid way of referring to ropes, why not call the things what they were, and ducking under the boom. There were tales of mishaps, of those who misjudged a turn and capsized, of the risks of a blow to the head knocking a sailor overboard, of the dangers of entanglement if those sheets were not secured properly. Accidents that could surely be encouraged with a little forethought.
"You appear pensive today, my friend,"
Sergio said as they ate, nothing too fancy, just a simple salad that would not upset the artist's delicate constitution.
"You did not enjoy yourself last night?"
On the contrary. It was an experience not to be missed, but it was so rich in fortuitous meetings, and wasn't that the truth, Rodin thought, that I'm still somewhat overwhelmed.
Frederick does put on a wonderful show, I'll give him that. Wasn't his creation inspired?
Rodin let Terrell make the right noises, and Sergio flowed into what amounted to a monologue on the man and his art. There was no substance to it though, and Rodin returned to sailing. He recapped what he had uncovered, sought ways to remove the target.
"Incidentally, I forwarded your contact details to Leopold,"
Sergio said.
"I believe he will reach out to you soon, as he dropped me a line asking if you were free in a couple of days."
Rodin smiled, and inside he chided himself for not checking his messages earlier. And am I?
"Most definitely. How can I stand in the way of you bettering yourself? Our erstwhile counselor might have ideas that rub some up the wrong way, but I have never found him anything less than congenial company. From the way you two were talking, I can see you getting along famously."
Try infamously, Rodin thought.
"But you were not the only one to have a fortuitous encounter yesterday."
Sergio smiled, clearly wanting Rodin to ask for more information. Rodin couldn't deny the artist his little game. "You met someone?"
"I met a great many people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was inspired by both conversations and surroundings. I saw my latest project in a new light. You, my finely sculpted friend, lit the fire, but last night provided both kindling and a fresh rush of oxygen."
Sergio waved a fork in the air as his enthusiasm grew.
"I believed this piece would be confrontational and blunt, much like your scars. But now I see subtleties. From a distance it might be viewed as a throwback to my safer works, but there will be a depth to this piece, secrets revealed only after careful study and contemplation. In fact, but no, it is too early to predict where it will stand in relation to those pieces."
He took a sip of his drink, then continued.
"Contrast. Much like the contrast in you, my friend. Your scars show a hardness, but your cooking is sublime, and you are a gentle and kind being. There is the contrast in the vulnerability of a naked body, but also the strength in the confidence with which you hold yourself. And I will go further. To counteract your masculinity, I require femininity. I can develop this through more contrasts. Perfection and imperfection, hope and despair, longing and dread."
Rodin expected Sergio to dissolve into further inanities, but the artist held up his hands and stopped.
"And it is on that point that I must tell you of my encounter last night. This woman, and there is no need to look at me like that, my young friend."
Rodin was certain he had shown nothing, but he smiled apologetically, let Sergio think what he would.
This woman captivated me with her charm, and her most wicked nature. Miss Shea, and isn't that a wonderful name, hinting at so much but admitting so little? Her name is perfect for such an unbridled creature, with such good nature that her most provocative comments can only be taken as playful flattery. Oh, we got along famously. But in our conversation she spoke of her niece, and this creature piqued my curiosity. My new acquaintance did not go into details, but she said enough to let me know that this young woman had experienced difficulties, and much like yourself has recently arrived from another dome. She is apparently a frail thing, with all her qualities and hopes hidden behind a nervous exterior. Miss Shea is naturally helping her become an upstanding, confident member of society, but she informs me that it will be a long process, rewarding yet also hard work. And that is when the spark ignited in my mind, and the muses came together. Here was a young woman of contrast, one who shared so much with my other model, while also being her own person. Here was the femininity to offset the masculinity, the fragile exterior to contrast your hardened outside, and maybe a tough inner strength to play against your inner warmth.
Rodin made appropriate expressions. He believed he saw where Sergio was going with this, but it was hard to follow him when he grew so animated.
So I have invited the young woman round with a view to her becoming a second model, of course, if she is amenable to such a notion.
The artist leaned back, his hands resting on his stomach and a broad grin on his face. He looked at Rodin in a manner that expected a response. "I'm pleased you had such a beneficial evening," he said, at a loss to add anything more.
You would not be opposed to modeling with another person?
In truth, I'd never modeled before a few days ago, and so this is all new to me. Modeling with someone else would simply be another fresh experience, and every experience is an opportunity to grow.
An excellent attitude, my young friend. I must say it appears that the troubles in your youth have granted you a wisdom that many twice your age are sorely lacking. I must thank Daventry once more for securing your situation here. He has surpassed himself. But returning to this young woman, I have invited her round later this evening to talk things through.
He glanced at the screen on the wall.
Oh, and I really must apologize for not forewarning you. She'll be here in an hour's time, and I had envisaged some kind of light spread.
He tilted his head, opened his eyes wide, trying to look pathetic.
I don't suppose there's any chance you can conjure something up, is there?
And he smiled in anticipation. Rodin was tempted to say that he had no time or suggest dry bread. But he couldn't do that to the man. "I did experiment with a recipe yesterday," he said, thinking of the time after he'd finished his chores and before Sergio was up. "It's not the best of cakes, but it might suffice. We still have fruit, and an hour will provide time to purchase other delicacies. I'm sure I can lay an adequate spread." Sergio beamed.
Oh, my friend, you're an angel. And I'm sure it will be far beyond merely adequate.
Rodin shrugged. "I'll do my best." It wasn't as if the artist was particularly fussy. If the cake was sweet and plastered with sickly icing, he'd be content. Sergio pushed himself away from the table. His grogginess from earlier was gone, and he practically bounced to his feet. Like a child, Rodin thought. And like a child he'd planned something, and only told others at the last minute. Probably wanted it to be a surprise. Not that it meant much to Rodin. A young woman, possibly modeling. She might be pleasant company, but it was only another distraction. She arrived exactly an hour later, the buzzer sounding as the lift arrived. Sergio had retired to his room to prepare, and was still behind his door. Daventry had turned up, possibly responding to a call from Sergio, and Rodin heard his office door open as he went to greet their guest. He heard footsteps and they entered.
"Mr. Terrell, may I introduce Miss Paskia?"
Daventry turned to the woman.
"This is Mr. Terrell, Sergio's assistant and model."
Her features were small, but that was only right, anything else would be out of place. Her skin was smooth, with a redness to her cheeks that might have been applied or might have been a nervous reaction. Her eyes were shaded beneath with a deep blue which seemed to amplify the depth, and Rodin found himself drawn to them. They possessed a sheen like the surface of a still clear pool, hinting at the depths below. He wondered if this were natural, or if she were wearing enhancements of some kind. But he pulled back, forced himself to take in the rest of her appearance. She wore a deep green robe, or maybe a cloak. It fastened near her neck, reached almost to the light sandals she wore on her feet, and had a hood that hung to the back. It was difficult to catch a clear view of her clothing under this garment. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Paskia." She looked at him coolly, polite but showing no emotion, and instantly Rodin saw this was taking some effort. When she spoke, her soft voice was frail, on the verge of cracking.
"Thank you, Mr. Terrell."
She took a step, leaving the safety of the doorway, entering the artist's domain. Daventry leaned in.
If you'll excuse my poor manners, I have pressing business to attend to.
He turned to Paskia.
Please forgive me, my dear.
"Of course,"
she said absently as Daventry backed out of the room. The air was warm and Rodin shuffled. The girl's eyes took in the room, avoiding him. "Please take a seat," he said, waving one hand to the sofas. "Sergio will be with us shortly."
"Yes. Thank you."
She shuffled to the closest sofa and perched on the edge, her hands resting on her knees. "Would you care for a drink?" Rodin asked, certain that there were rules of social etiquette for situations like this, and hoping he wasn't offending their guest.
"Oh, I'm fine.
"You sure? It's no problem."
Just a glass of water then. Thank you."
She glanced up at him, then her eyes darted away. Rodin poured a couple of glasses, the water running loudly, and then opened the drink's chiller, removing one of the bottles of sickly sweet stuff Sergio preferred. He decanted this to a third glass, placed them on a tray and returned to the sofas. Paskia still sat straight-backed, her robe clasped tight around her body. He handed her one of the glasses, which she took with thanks and a flicker of a smile, before he reclined into the other sofa. It didn't feel right to sit too close. "You're comfortable?" he asked.
"Oh yes, I'm fine, thanks."
Rodin knew she wasn't. "Would you like to have a moment to yourself, or maybe a quick visit to the restroom?"
"No, I'm fine really. A few nerves, that's all. My guardian took control of all the arrangements, and I have merely turned up as instructed. To be perfectly frank, I'm not sure what to expect."
"You have no need to worry. Sergio is a most genial host. He will do all he can to place you at your ease,"
My assistant is quite correct in what he says, my dear girl,
said Sergio, entering the room. He wore a short robe over a white shirt and grey voluminous trousers, and had his usual soft slippers on his feet.
I am Sergio, and I believe you are Paskia, are you not? Yes, we had a brief discussion through the screen, with your aunt arranging matters. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance in person, my dear. And may I say that you are even more perfect in the flesh than you appeared in our previous brief conversation.
He went over to her, his hand held out. Shaking, she offered her own hand, which he held delicately and brought it up to his lips, hovering. Rodin noticed a flicker of unease in Sergio's eyes, and he let her hand slide from his, never quite kissing it. She smiled, blushing, and Sergio seated himself, sinking back into the cushions. He thanked Rodin for the drink, took a sip, and then they talked. To be more accurate, Sergio talked, asking the occasional question which Paskia answered quietly and carefully, weighing each word before allowing it past her lips. Rodin sat and watched, adding the occasional comment when he felt it appropriate. It was hard to tell the woman's age. There was an air of youth and innocence about her. She could be barely 18, or she could be in her 30s with surgery and alterations, possibly 40 or even 50. But Rodin got the impression she didn't go in for alterations. There was a mark, just behind her left ear, only visible on occasions when she brushed her hair from her face. It was only a small scar, the type of blemish that could be removed with ease, and yet it remained. There was an attractive fragility to her, and Rodin, much to his surprise, imagined holding her. Not in a sexual way, but as one might hold a child, close, gentle, still, content. It may have been nothing more than the simple desire to protect the vulnerable. But when had he ever entertained such thoughts? As she relaxed and let the robe hang looser, her arms became visible for fleeting seconds, and Rodin could tell that she had good muscle tone, not enough to look bulky but enough to hint at hidden strength in a fight. He imagined she was quick, lithe, subtle, the kind of opponent who would slip from your grasp. Of course, she wouldn't be a fighter. Maybe she took part in sports, possibly some of the balletic faux fighting activities that were so popular in the Dome. But she wouldn't be used to the type of fighting where points and technique meant nothing, where the winner was the last one alive. She accepted Sergio's suggestion that they share food, and Rodin headed to the food prep to prepare their spread, listening as the artist continued waffling over their snacks, and Sergio made far too much of Rodin's cake. She loosened up and responded to Sergio's gentle probing by talking of her life. She had moved to the Dome only a month ago, under the watchful eye of her aunt, this shade that Sergio had befriended at the party. Pasquia was determined to make a fresh start, and to put behind her all those previous difficulties. Sergio probed delicately, but Pasquia was unwilling to divulge any details of the problems she had faced.
I understand, my dear. But maybe you can take some comfort in knowing that Terrell, like yourself, has newly moved to our illustrious first Dome, and is also removing himself from a troubled past. Oh, this bodes well for the work we will be undertaking. It does indeed bode well.
But Rodin thought, whatever her secrets are, they don't involve payment for death. Pasquia's secrets might cause others to look down on her, but his secrets, if known, would result in his instant removal. He was still intrigued, though. Then there was Shay. Rodin wondered what her role was, whether she was guard or friend. Pasquia talked of her life in broad terms, leaving details alone but hinting at a happy childhood, of a love of water, and of having a close group of friends, few in number but strong in bond. When she spoke of these friends, she hesitated, struggling to find the right words. At the same time, she glanced over to Rodin. Maybe he reminded her of one of those friends. Or maybe Sergio, alluding to similarities between herself and Terrell, had struck a chord, and she was looking for kinship. Or maybe she found his presence disturbing. Without clear data, he'd make no judgment. She continued talking of some of the major events of her life, passing her formal education with honors, to the surprise of many of her tutors, her 18th birthday party, the moment she became an adult, gaining her first official employment, working as an analyst at a water park. Finally, she talked of her arrival in First Dome, the day before she turned 32. Rodin pondered the number. 32, her birthday a month ago. He believed he was of a similar age. Judging on appearances, most people would surely put 10 or even 20 years between them, and not in Rodin's favor. The meeting between Pasquia and the artist ended with pleasantries and smiles. The exact nature of the work had not been discussed, but this was no problem. The important thing, according to Sergio, was that Pasquia felt at ease. When she returned the following morning, work would begin in earnest. Daventry returned to the room and escorted the young woman to the lift. Sergio explained to Rodin how he would like the studio prepared before he excused himself, heading for his suite. Rodin remained on the sofa, deep in thought. This girl, no woman, was a distraction, but he found her intriguing. Or maybe it was the way she talked of her past, leaving much uncovered. Rodin couldn't help but wonder what trauma she'd endured.